Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first Lumen live Facebook broadcast. I'm Maya Zuckerman, the COO of Lumen, and we have Tirza Hollenhorst, the CEO of Lumen, and we're going to do a quick conversation on post-pandemic value shift. We've been looking at signals, and we'd love to hear some signals that you've been seeing, but we're going to go through 9 signals that we've been looking at. And over to you, Tirza. We're just going to go into it. First signal that we actually saw is the infrastructure over excitement. And just give a little bit of meat. This is the breakdown of supply chain and our medical system. We'll turn our attention back to the value of real, reliable infrastructure. So let's talk a little bit about what we've been noticing.
Well, I think we're seeing right now how important fundamental infrastructure like our public school system, our postal system, our public transportation, our basic public health, and then even some like fundamental supply chains that have broken down a bit over the past few months. And as we've recognized that really fundamental things that we really take for granted, like the post office, is not actually a given. I believe that we're really going to see a rerouting in the willingness to invest in and value those kind of fundamental infrastructure things that aren't sexy. And so we've been able to take them for granted, but are really fundamental to a functional society.
Yeah, and I'm going to add, we've seen how broken our supply chains are because we've gone everything both efficient and outsourced and offshored a lot of our medical supply chains. And during COVID, that was a huge problem. So we're going to also see more hybrid of local and international and moving back into manufacturing in the local regions. You're actually seeing that in California, where they're actually trying to bring in more manufacturing back in California because of COVID. So that's definitely one big signal we're seeing.
I think you're going to see that with manufacturing kind of across the board, but almost everything that we utilize on a daily, weekly basis, both as individuals, as families, as businesses, we've been able to really take a great deal of it for granted and be looking for what's the next shiny thing and ignore, the tap being on, the mail getting picked up, and electricity being there when we flip our lights, and all of that has really been called into question, and we've been able to see really how fragile a lot of our systems are on their face. And as we begin to look forward and recognize how fragile things are, I don't think it's just about resiliency, but I think the values of security and reliability are also going to come into play in that focus on infrastructure.
Yeah, those are all great points. And you talked about shiny things, and I think it's time we go to number 2, which is competency over celebrity. And we've seen that in some of our elected leaders that are doing work, like Fauci. Even we're just talking before, and you mentioned Kamala Harris is a competency vote. She is extremely competent. And the need for more of competencies versus anybody who has, a million followers on Instagram becomes an expert. That's the problem when we actually don't get the real information and the real expertise in during these times. Anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think when we first wrote these, when we were at the beginning of the pandemic, we hadn't yet seen some of the undermining that celebrity could be doing in these times. And I think we're really in a moment where not only are we seeing a value shift toward competency, but we actually need to promote a shift toward competency, that revaluing expertise and revaluing experience, revaluing what we might call scientific research versus the kind of internet research that people have come to believe is actual research, but actually can lead you directly into an echo chamber. I've seen both a shift in values toward this, but I actually think there's a way that we need to find a way to root ourselves in this value of competency.
Yeah, agreed. And actually honor people who have done the deep work of working and understanding that, yeah, like you said, researching on the internet, people, is not research. That's you're actually looking at the internet. And it's great. Now you can actually show it to somebody who's done their research, who's a scientist in the field, and ask them if that's possible. But yeah, that is definitely something we've been noticing a lot. And moving along to, because we have 9 of these, empathy over advertising. And I actually brought up a lot of things that we've noticed, especially in the beginning of it. We noticed companies that didn't stop their MailChimp or whatever email marketing they were doing, or whatever thing that was already programmed, to stop and not being tone deaf to the situation. So that was like, March and April. Now it really is. I've seen a lot of ads on "We're here together." We're here to support you. This is not about just selling, but reminding you that we actually care. And seeing a lot of brands taking that lead on the caring conversation. I've even seen a really beautiful ad about, and something we'll talk about later, a very diverse ad for Old Navy, and basically just celebrating BLM, the LGBTQ movement, and just saying, hey, we're all here. We're all are here together. So I'm seeing a lot of those signals from marketing, and not as much as like pushing just the marketing towards you. Besides the fact that I'm sure all of us have had the experience of the amount of mask marketing that we've been getting, masks, of all kinds and shapes on every page. So that is definitely something of the marketing du jour. Any other things that you're noticing in the empathy versus advertising?
Um, I'm also seeing kind of the opposite of this just a little bit, where we're seeing our empathy and our concern actually kind of turned against us a little bit, where people are kind of perverting people's concern for children, and like to suggest that they shouldn't need to wear masks to go back to school in those areas that are opening up, and that somehow the like requirement of separating kids and social distancing among children is abuse. And there is a certain amount of weaponizing our empathy and our concern for others in that. And there's just, that's the dark edge of this empathy piece, is that it's also being weaponized, and our concern for the isolation that we're all experiencing, and somehow suggesting that that sacrifice isn't worth it. And I think that the anecdote for this is really just a broader view. We live in a generation that's had such limited experience with disruption, whether from war or famine or shortage. We just don't actually have a felt sense of collective sacrifice. And so our empathy with those who are experiencing sacrifice can actually be perverted.
Yeah, that's a huge point. And we're not going to even go down into the rabbit hole of where empathy and media is weaponized to actually create disinformation. And there's a lot of conversation online on that. And also the idea that we don't have discernment. So I think that's a deeper conversation we can actually put for one of the next signals. And also, I think it's signal number 6 when we get there. Moving on to exponential over linear. So one of the big learning from these times is finally everybody understood what exponentials are, with the way we looked at the virus. And now people understand that, if you take 100 steps in virus land, 100 days actually took us from just a few thousand cases to now America having over 5 million. So just understanding what exponentials versus linear movement, it also taught us how to go quicker, and also maybe perhaps learn how to not let our media rule us if we're actually looking at the signal before, because every time you have that kind of viral idea, it can spread in a way that's actually extremely unhealthy. But that's definitely something I've noticed, that now people, when I speak about exponentials, people understand what that is.
Yeah, I think that's one of the, silver linings, as they say, in this whole process, is that we've really gotten a very visceral lesson in exponential behavior. And the important thing is that this applies not just to viruses, but also to climate change and, loss of topsoil. And there's many of these things that have feedback loops that create an exponential process. And appreciating nonlinearity is really vital to the future thrivability of our society. And but fundamentally, our brains are really wired to think linearly and mathematically, and to assume that things grow in a mathematical way. That's why we get tripped up by these brain teasers about lily pads increasing on ponds. And this element of education that's happened as we've had beautiful graphs produced by some of our major media publications, and then actually seen the numbers grow, has been really, really important. My only concern is that we've somehow become a little bit pacified and used to, accustomed to this idea of these large numbers that have kind of crept up on us, what seemingly slowly at first and then quickly, a little like the kind of frog in the pot.
Yeah, and I think that this is a whole other conversation, and definitely around empathy, is that we have compassion fatigue, and the numbers fatigue, compassion fatigue. They even talked about that 2 weeks ago was when we all hit the wall on oversaturation about talking about COVID, because there's no other conversation. But also in a more higher level systemic conversation is if we've only been there for 4 months. Humans live an average of 75 to 85 years in the global north. And the earth is 4.4 billion years. 4 months is nothing. So I think it's also learning how to look at systems from a broader perspective and really understand. I mean, even yesterday I posted to somebody like, it's only been 4 or 5 months. We don't know 6, 7 months, whatever it is. We've only been in this for a very short time. We don't know enough. And the collective we, all the scientists and all of the researchers and the doctors and the people and everything are trying to make sense about this together. It's not simple, but we're moving really fast. So I think there is some time of like a little bit of compassion for where we are during these times. And I think we're doing pretty well for where we're at.
Yeah, our next trend is inclusion over exclusivity. At the very beginning of the going into shutdown, when we first began to see caseloads rise, I felt that there was a great deal of backlash against any message that felt exclusive, and there was a lot of emphasis on inclusion. And then, of course, after the murder of George Floyd, we really saw this whole awakening of what inclusivity might actually mean in the United States. And so I think inclusion means something really different, even when I first wrote this. But I also think we're going to see a new wave of awareness around inclusion as we begin to see the whole eviction crisis take hold in the next, 2 to 5 months.
Yeah. Inclusivity, and I think where we are right now in the time, especially in America, is we don't know. Every month is month to month, but it really it brings forward what we've already talked about, that infrastructures are not working. What is actually left is who we are as a community and communities, and how do we support each other. And it's not simple, and it's not going to be simple. But I think there is a moment now in America that I've never experienced as a new immigrant of, and I heard it in a podcast by a Black gentleman that talked about, he's a Black professor, And he talked about a moment that he had where he was hanging with his other Black friends on a Sunday having a picnic, social distance picnic, and he saw a group of white people marching with BLM signs and inclusion signs and fighting and defund the police. And he's like, this is great. We get to have lunch. We get to have a picnic on a Sunday, and they're taking over. So there's something there that is new and I think exciting and positive that is coming out of all of this turmoil that we're in.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think we're going to see that same conversation carry over to education, and access to the internet and access to bandwidth. And I think in all of its kind of pedestrian charm, we're going to even have the same conversation when it comes to like access to the postal service.
Yeah.
And very fundamentals and access and inclusion are going to be part of the conversation in 2021.
Yeah. And moving into transparency over ignorance, this is a huge signal. We're actually moving more towards ignorance at this point. There are a lot of wonderful companies trying to create more transparency, but really what is happening is there is a mistrust in our current systems. And some of it is not completely with reason. Some of it is with a lot of reason. And I've seen the movement towards ignorance and weaponized information, weaponized media, and not understanding that with all the good ideas and good intent, there's a lot of weaponized disinformation campaigns right now coming out from Russia, China, North Korea. They're heavily documented. We know that that is happening, but there's also lack of media literacy and understanding how to decipher and sense make, also because it's really hard. I mean, it's not like we're not coming to blame every person to say, oh, you're not smart. It's extremely hard to do that. And without any kind of form of real media literacy, and also having the big four tech giants not actually doing their job in protecting fake news from real news, and actually creating safe havens for a lot of nefarious groups to act within them. And this is talking about, they just removed one QAnon group from Facebook, but there's like millions of them. So, really that conversation, and also the very tight rope of people's understanding of where does free speech and hate speech stand on the kind of scale. So that it's a very complex issue that I'm seeing, and I've been tracking and reading and trying to educate myself, not researching, educating myself as much as I can.
Yeah, when we first began looking at these trends, transparency felt like the direction things were heading. And I have to agree that at this point, I feel like there's a certain amount of ignorance that's certainly tipping the balance. And there's this fight, it almost feels like, in between the desire for inclusion and to hear all voices and all sides, and the need for to really appreciate competency. It's like inclusion and competency are somehow at odds right now.
Yeah.
And what's losing in that is some amount of transparency. And I'm not exactly, I don't think that there's going to be a good general solution for this. The challenge of moving into this new era where we are all creators of content, and we get to define our consumption of content, is that we all get to take on our own responsibility for being clear what we're taking in and what we're sharing and the consequences of that. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that everyone has come to appreciate that. They kind of like share things in part because it created an emotional jarring for them. And so like, ooh, I got a buzz out of that. I'll share that buzz, rather than discerning whether it was actually good content, or relevant or kind or generative. And so if I were to shift this one, I would shift that there's the value shift that needs to happen is really around like responsibility for what you're creating with the information you're sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. And also understanding that depending on where you're sharing it, but it's also not even depending, is all of these media have algorithms that are programmed and developed to get more likes and more shares. And the extremes always do that. So extreme cuteness on one side, cats, kittens, puppies, babies, and extreme radicalism. And that is actually what is shared the most, and not actually deep content. So knowing that we're working inside of these algorithms and actually learning how to trick those algorithms if you want to actually have a message that is deeper, that has good content with it. And it's not an easy thing. It really is not an easy thing. And let's move into number 7, virtualization over physical. We're virtual.
Everything's virtual.
We are zombies now, or Google Teams zombies, or zombies, or if people still use Skype, I don't know. But
there are a few people who use Skype. They work for Microsoft.
Yes.
It's been really interesting watching the event space try to adopt virtual. It's been like we've seen this huge move as all the event creators try to move some of their content virtual, and I saw so many amazing like beautiful proliferations of dance and various forms of content, and even huge like 3-day events with like live streams going all day long. And I need to admit, like, I have not tuned into like content in what feels like months, but surely is weeks. And I'm curious, Maya, for all the proliferation that we initially saw, like, how do you think virtual content's doing, like these virtual events?
Some of them are doing well. I still see a lot of them. I think I'm with you. Oh, well, here's the truth. I've gone to many conferences in my life. Most of the time I'm hanging in the lobby with my friends. And you've written a wonderful article called How to Lose $127,000 in 1 hour.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it's an issue because actually even the most engaging conferences, it's actually in the chance random meetings. And my experience lately has been chance random meetings online has been the best thing that I've actually experienced online. And we've done a bunch of really interesting interactive experiences in Lumen and workshops. I've just co-facilitated it's like 96 people on Miro, doing a exercise in user journey. So I think there is something about what Lumen does more, which is more interaction that actually works, where the big conferences is a little bit harder. It's so hard to actually really truly engage. And sometimes you'll just put it in the background. So I'm kind of finding that the smaller, more intimate Zoom events, workshops where you actually get to do or build something together, love those. And I'm seeing more and more of those and more of these smaller conversations versus the large ones because it's harder. So that's what I've been noticing.
Bringing us to unity over egotism. I wonder, like, I think we have been really seeing of the continued rise of a message of unity and togetherness. We still see we're in this together as the broader message that a lot of people are using, and a certain amount of like camaraderie with people who we maybe in the past didn't experience a sense of camaraderie with, like what we now call essential workers, which is our grocery workers, our Lyft drivers, people who are really still out in contact with the public on a day-to-day basis. There's a sense of unity with those folks that wasn't there before. And I think that will, over time, also translate into a sense of inclusion of what it really means to work together in a society. How do you feel about that, Maya? How's that going? Where are you seeing that going right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually seeing the signal is definitely more towards collective work, not collectivism, but collective work, collective journey, collective supporting each other. I mean, I still have neighbors that every day at 7, this is August, are banging their pots. So for the essential workers, it's now become this like neighborhood thing. I'm experiencing how people are really wanting each other, really want to connect, and really want to help. And every time I've seen anybody, there's been so much sorrow and grief during these times. And wherever we've seen that, we've seen everybody coming together, everybody wanting to support each other. So I'm seeing more of that. I brought up the book about peak, or the professor that talked about peak assholes, and they were living in the time of peak assholes. And I think we are at the peak. This is going to tumble down, because I think people are also sick and tired of the egomaniacs. And I think also that's why the extreme of what we're also noticing, even some, and it's Bob Sutton, is the guy who wrote the article and also the book about peak assholes. We're also seeing that the very loud voices on Facebook, the kind of weaponize conspiracy theories, are extremely coming from ego, even though they're saying, oh, we're hashtag saving the children and all of that. By the way, if anybody knows, that's a huge old libel, and every 20 years we have that like conversation about the satanic panic, and before that it was blood libels with Jews. This is very, very old. So not that there aren't horrific people that are doing these horrific things, but yeah, like I think the egoic is so extreme right now, and the unity is so powerful, and you're seeing it in all of these amazing groups coming together. And then not that there is also the kind of the opposite, the kind of anti-masker, anti-vaxxer groups as well. They don't care, but it's like that's a bunch of egos coming together to say, look at my ego, look at my ego. That's actually virtue signaling versus true solidarity, which is what I've seen doing marching in the protests here in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting as we look at each of these. I can see how there's actually I wrote them with an over, but you could just as much write them with a versus. Mm-hmm. There's a certain amount of conflict between these two extremes, especially as we move deeper into this pandemic, and this goes on for longer. Mm-hmm. The final trend that we've been talking about is this move toward purpose over profit. And I think we're seeing this in a couple different places. We're seeing it as people are needing to really reinvent and find new paths for themselves, asking themselves very deeply, well, what am I really here for? Because if I have to reinvent myself, if what I was doing no longer works, what am I doing and who am I? But then I also think we're seeing a real concern and awareness of those companies that are profiting in these times. And we're seeing it in conversations about, companies that have secured money to produce vaccines and what they're actually going to charge for that. We're seeing it in terms of like backlash against Amazon, who's been a great winner in all of this. And we could go on. I think there's just been a real awareness that we do want everybody to be thriving, and we want sustainable, profitable business models. But who gets to profit and at what price is a broader conversation we're seeing.
Big time. I mean, this is such an important conversation, especially that, and we talk about this a lot. This pandemic is a little blimp. It's like it's the appetizer of the big apocalypse, and we're not all of us are managing very well, and there's a lot of us that are. I like the kind of nuance of we're in the same storm, but not in the same boat. Some of us are in extremely leaking boats, and some of us are in luxury boats, and some of us are in balanced boats. So also understanding that when we talk about purpose over profit, a lot of us, and I'm kind of using the kind of us as the human race, human species, are experiencing this pandemic in a really bad situation and can't even think about like, what's my purpose though? Like, first, what do I get to eat? So I think there's a lot of that conversation as well, and also holding these large organizations accountable is another conversation that is not even like purpose over profit, but having them accountable for choosing profit and choosing lower common denominator and money instead of actually choosing people. So I think there is backlash. I think there is definitely backlash around that.
Well, that's brought us through our trends
Yeah.
that we have identified. We'd really love to hear from all of you about what trends you're seeing and what value shifts you think we're heading into as we move through this pandemic. You can drop your thoughts in the comments. We would love to be in conversation. We're going to continue this conversation in a symposium on mega trends later in September. So if you drop yourself into the comments, we'll also know you're interested in this conversation. So
Yeah.
that's it for us today. Maya, you want to close us out?
Yes. So yeah, we're really excited to hear from you. As Teresa said, drop us in the comments, or you can also email us at connect at lumen.io, lumen spelled Luman. And let us know if you got any value out of this conversation. This is the first of many, hopefully, and really excited to be in this conversation always with you, Tirza.
Thank you, Maya.